Picture this. Imagine that everything at this very instant were to go dark. You are no longer allowed to hear or see or think or even be. And then suddenly, in the next second, you wake up to find yourself in a place that you cannot understand. This place is cold and open and empty. Its sky is red and green and yellow and everything. Its landscape is filled with bones the size of mountains, and above you are a bunch of floating black diamonds with GPS coordinates labeled onto them. Then you come to realize that a man is now standing in front of you. This man appears to be wearing a top hat, a Rolex, a sake backpack, and is holding onto an iPhone. He then goes on to tell you that what humans often call him is a Grim Reaper, which leaves you to ask one single and simple question. Where the hell am I? In the year of 1308, a writer, poet, and Italian man by the name of Dante Alighieri began to work on a poem that would end up becoming one of the most well-known pieces of fiction to ever exist in human history. It was called the Divine Comedy, and while none of it was funny, it did contain 338 pages of words that told a story about a guy venturing through 3 realms. These were called Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. At the time, Dante had just been permanently exiled from his home Florence due to a war that had occurred between 2 political factions called the Guelphs. This left him with the only choice that any upset and petty artist would do in such a circumstance. He depicted a realm that contained the cruelest forms of torture, gave it 9 layers, and then decided to write in his political enemies as characters that deserved to be at the bottom. These layers were split into circles of divine punishment, with each of them being descendingly more gruesome and vile based on the sins that one had committed in the overworld. On the upper circles, you had limbo, lust, gluttony, greed, and wrath, described as places that would use torture methods ranging from eternal loneliness and violent storms all the way to endless combat or being forced to push boulders forever. In the lower circles, you had heresy, violence, fraud, and treachery, which also contained subdivisions of layers based on the specific and exact sin that was committed. This is where Dante decided to add demons into the equation and got real creative. In the circles of heresy and violence, humans would get trapped into burning pits, drowned in a lake of boiling hot blood, or would mutate into thorny trees and then get ripped apart by harpies. Mutated into thorny trees and then ripped apart by harpies. In the circle of fraud, you would get sliced from the groin to the head, disfigured, forced to permanently walk with your head backwards, chased by lizards, or be buried alive upside down based on whichever subdivision of fraud was committed. And then finally, at the bottom layer of hell for treachery, the punishment here was to be forcefully lodged into a thick layer of ice. And what I love is that to Dante, the bottom layer of hell was supposed to be this exclusive realm that's dedicated to the cruelest, most fucked up people in all of existence. It's like the Berghain of evil people. Yet even then, the punishment he came up with was not to pour lava into their eyes, or force them to chug acid, or be impaled, or crushed, or wheeled, or any of the weird methods that we had actually done to other humans by that time. No, the worst punishment he could possibly imagine was the idea of being eternally stuck in ice next to Satan and all of his worst enemies. The premise behind the Divine Comedy revolved around a self-inserted protagonist named Dante. He was written to be a character that had led a disgraceful life and would eventually go on a journey seeking redemption through his ascent from hell to purgatory and to paradise. And through an infinite combination of circumstance and coincidence, the first part of the Divine Comedy, called Dante's Inferno, would end up having a profound impact on the way art and fiction would forever depict hell. And you see, the thing about influence is that it kind of works in the same way as fire. One flame can trigger another, and then another, and then another, and before you know it, the whole village is burning without leaving any form of trace as to how it all began. This then leads me to the person that I believe is responsible for lighting that second match. A match that arrived 100 years later, when a Dutch artist had mysteriously left behind a shit ton of paintings. An artist who's probably a contender for the first place award and having the coolest name in history. That artist was Hieronymus Bosch. Now, if you try to look up any bit of information about Hieronymus Bosch, you will likely arrive at the common conclusion that not much is known about the guy. Even his supposed self-portrait was just a sketch that he had made a few years prior to his death. There is no actual confirmation as to whether or not that's supposed to be him. But what Bosch left behind for history to spend centuries analyzing were around 25 paintings. 16 of them were triptychs that contained beautiful and terrifying depictions of these realms that we have commonly known to understand. Most famously, his piece called The Garden of Earthly Delights paints this out in 3 parts. On the left, you have the Garden of Eden, where all things are chill and peaceful, and oh look, there's Adam and Eve, and oh look, there's Jesus hanging out with them. Are those birds eating frogs? How silly! And in the middle, you have humanity coexisting alongside the fruits of nature. They're partying, they're even kissing, they're having the time of their life. And then on the right, you have demon-like figures pillaging their way into the kingdom, setting everything ablaze and making humanity pay for the consequence of existing. It is the end of times being fused by the embers of humiliation. God is dead, and all that is left for us is to be disfigured from our own sense of self, to hear the echoes of laughter being aimed at our own misery, and containing possibly the worst punishment of them all: being branded on the butt with musical notes. When played on the piano, this is what the sheet music translates to. Hieronymus, you're a genius. All of Bosch's paintings were like this. They were filled with hundreds of small little moments that all added up to tell a story out of dreams and nightmares and weird abstract depictions of humanity. The guy is now dead. There's no information to find out about who he was or in what context these paintings were made. All that we were left with here was a pile of stories to interpret and analyze to whatever way we please. And so we did. We spent decades and centuries seeking meaning through these depictions of human suffering. We were taught that hell could not only be a place that caused pain, but a place that made you lose your own sense of self. It could be confusing and humiliating. These concepts would then ignite the flames of inspiration of some of our greatest painters in history: Michelangelo, Peter Paul Rubens, and William Blake, all adding in their own version of what they imagined such a place to be. Pretty much any painter with a name and an opinion at some point depicted their own version of hell. Out of all of them, my favorite would easily have to be the works of Gustave Dore. In the 1860s, he released a massive set of sketches for Dante's poems, which allowed for me to put visuals into that section. These objectively look stunning, by the way, especially coming from someone who's obsessed with the art style of manga, but the one that I love most is his painting called Dante and Virgil, which shows the two of them walking through the bottom layer of hell, mostly because it looks like they're staring at the people like, yes, eat the sucks to suck. Even in different religious contexts, hell comes with totally different rules based on where you're looking at. In Hinduism and Buddhism, where the concept of karma plays a significant role, hell is viewed as an in-between place for one's death and rebirth. If you lived a life filled with severely bad karma, then you get temporarily sent to a hell called Naraka, and are left to stay there until you've been completely stripped of that karma. But as the centuries passed and the rock spun, media would go on to shift and recreate this realm of divine punishment in as many ways as possible. Some of its key elements were changed, but some of it was never able to detach itself from the idea of hell. But all of this has led me to ask one single question here. What is hell become? What does the average person, regardless of religious upbringing, picture when they hear the H word? Is it a flaming pit of lava filled with bats and caves and demons and Satan? Or is it empty and cold and filled with ghosts and screaming and suffering? Is the pain physical or is it internal? Is it eternal or is it temporary? Even if you begin to barely pay attention to it, you'll realize that the influence of Dante's Inferno has left its mark in pretty much everywhere. Sometimes it's obvious, like in Doom, where you're practically playing as Dante trying to escape from the depths of hell. Hell, you could even say that any game design with levels and floors and prisoners all follow the same formula of his circles. But sometimes you gotta stick your nose out a little bit. Sometimes you gotta sniff out its influence. For example, in the anime series Made in Abyss, you have a main character named Riko, who seeks to uncover a mystery behind the crater that's at the center of her hometown. As she explores into its depths, she begins to realize the terrors that lie beneath the ground that she's been living upon. each layer gradually becoming more and more haunting, until she eventually reaches a point where her own body begins to reject the environment itself. And sometimes you have to really roll up your sleeves to try to look closely at who's been diddling around with the concept of a divine punishment. For example, Franz Kafka's Metamorphasis is a divine punishment. It's a simple story about a guy named Greg who wakes up one day to discover that he's now become a giant cockroach. It then goes on to describe in great detail the specific and horrifying aftermath of what it's like to deal with that. For example, he wants to get out of bed, but he can't because he has tiny little leg hands now because he's a cockroach. He has to go to work and his mom's like, honey, you have to go to work, but he can't because he's a cockroach. Hell has now metamorphosized itself into anything of the imagination. Sometimes it's now a plushie. Sometimes it can be a costume for kids. Sometimes it's used to describe a minimum wage job or a $20 game on Steam. Sometimes it's this.
Hell is a dark forest where your dad opens his rib cage and invites you to dance.
Sometimes it's a realm that shows up in the South Park musical, where Kenny gets sent to the afterlife and ends up meeting Satan, who's in a deep homoerotic relationship with Saddam Hussein. This later on becomes a pressing issue throughout the movie because Satan begins to feel unheard. The deity of pure evil then goes on to mention that at its core, maybe their relationship has begun to falter due to their different types of love languages. Satan cares deeply about spending quality time, while Saddam, on the other hand, clearly is more in line with their expression of physical touch. And then after this, oh, I'm sorry, did you forget what this video was about? My goal here today is to do a little bit of exploring through the depths of hell depictions that were made by insane people. I want to see what are some of the ways that we've mutated Dante's poems and turned it into our own weird creations. This now leads me to the part where I'd like to mention the obvious. This is a two-way discussion. If you're watching this and you happen to think to yourself, hey, that's not weird, I just so happen to know many things that are much more strange and weird than that, then please, go ahead and let me know what other media I should consider. I am just a guy who likes things. I am not a database. But this first one I'm gonna mention should not be a surprise to any of you. And I'm so confident in that belief that I'm gonna ask you to tell me, what piece of media do I just so happen to love that just so happens to have a weird depiction of hell in it? It's fucking Chainsaw Man. In chapter 63 of Chainsaw Man, there's a scene where Denji and his team of devil hunters end up getting in a fight with a doll lady named Santa Claus. And right when she's at the brink of death, at the very last second, Santa Claus decides to form a contract with the Hell Devil. This then gets followed up by a panel of a giant godlike hand spawning over the building and then grabbing a hold of its existence. Not the building, its existence. Then suddenly, the members of the public safety devil hunting team end up finding themselves in a strange place. Below them is a field of grass. In the middle, there's a bathtub. Above them are a bunch of doors, and on the grass are tiny chopped up fingers scattered everywhere. This is what the author of this manga, Tatsuki Fujimoto, envisioned for himself when he thought of hell. But before any of the characters can ask what's going on, they then take note of one of the doors being swung open, letting out a mysterious drop of black liquid that falls onto the floor. It's far away, but they can tell that it's beginning to take shape. This shape then proceeds to introduce itself, striding forward on a walkway made out of an astronaut graveyard and then revealing to the hunters what it really is. The Darkness Devil. And what I love, especially in this panel, is the role this devil's cloak plays in the composition of the panel. It's not just a thing that's taking up space, it's subtracting from it. It's in the same shade as the background behind it, removing any evidence of things being there, removing the proof of its existence. In the story of Chainsaw Man, there are devils that coexist alongside humanity, and what I love so dearly about this manga is the way that Fujimoto explores this. In it, there is a devil for every single human fear. The fear of snakes, leeches, dolls, mouths, muscles, ears, you name it. And their strength and power in this universe is fully reliant on how much humanity fears that concept. This is what the bitterness devil looks like, and this is what the chicken devil looks like. While on the other hand, this is what the cockroach devil looks like, and this is what the gun devil devil looks like. And this place that we have stumbled upon is the source to all of these fears. Behind each door, that kind of looks like that one part of Monsters Inc., lies the entrance to where these devils come from. And Fujimoto decided to present the forms of these fears through our own understanding of them. Light fundamentally is the dominant source to how humans collect information. Without it, we are nothing. We would be unable to survive as a species. According to NASA, around 95% of our galaxy is unable to interact with light. This is the reason why this manga depicts the darkness devil as such a terrifying creature. Its inspirations are rooted in how we've been exploring space, where humans have tried and tried again to understand this void of darkness. And if that's the case, if that's really what's going on here, that the devils in Chainsaw Man are birthed from our own fears, then that also means that we are its creator. We are behind the steering wheel of the things that exist in it, and we get to decide which ones are the strongest. This gets explained more thoroughly in the arc where the main characters meet the Eternity Devil. At first, they find themselves exploring through a hotel, left with the simple assignment of killing a small devil that has placed a curse on the building. Eventually, they find it and they do exactly that. The main reason why this mission was so simple was because we as humans don't ever really think about the concept of eternity. We don't know anything that is eternal, so we don't really care for it. But as they continue on with their mission, they begin to realize that this hotel didn't have any exits. Going downstairs or upstairs led them to the exact same floor. Even worse, the devil hunters arrive at the conclusion that time itself has become stuck here. One of them decides to revisit the place where they initially killed off the Eternity Devil, only to then realize that throughout this time it had been gradually becoming stronger, leading us to understand that the force behind each devil is also ever changing. We know this best from what the gun devil becomes throughout the manga. As humanity progressed, it also ended up being the creator of a monster. In Chainsaw Man, we are the ones responsible for the existence of hell. But why don't we sit on that burger for a second? I'm sure that whole spiel about eternity won't come back later in this video or anything like that. However, on the spectrum of being either cool or weird, I'd say Chainsaw Man definitely falls under the category of being sick as hell, no pun intended. Hell, pun intended, was depicted as a field of grass with chopped up fingers and covered with doors to all of our fears. It's even got a bathtub in the middle of it for reasons that I don't really understand why to this day. But I say now let's turn the knob a little bit on the scale of weirdness. Let's move on to another story where instead of hell just being one small setting of many, it is the story. Let's talk about a manhwa, where hell is a battle royale. Hellper is a manhwa about a guy named Jang, who after getting into a bike accident wakes up to find himself in the middle of hell. Except hell in this case is an empty white plain filled with ghosts and spirits and bones and floating apartment buildings. On his wrist he notices that he's now wearing a bracelet that contains one single white stripe. The bracelet represents his life force, indicating how far he is from being able to escape from this strange place. The way the afterlife in the story works is really simple. Jang currently has one ticket, and if he can figure out a way to obtain 100 of them, he is allowed to escape from this place. But if you lose all your tickets, then you're doomed to eternally stay in this realm as a massive blob of dark matter. This then entails Jang to go on a journey where he fights through a vast set of enemies in hopes of obtaining all of these tickets, which eventually ends up turning the manhwa from something you simply just read into something you actually get to experience. Rather than it guiding you through the page like a manga, manhwa is a medium where moments get revealed to you. Fight scenes in Hellper are uniquely able to carry this weight along with them because of how often the author's sack is allowed to dedicate multiple panels to the build-up and then leave you with this nuclear bomb of a payoff. But none of those things are the real source of my obsession with this story. No, I'd say it comes from the grains of creative insanity that are planted within it. Its blend of colors, its art style, its gradients between fashion and hip-hop and mysticism. It's the fact that hell, to the author, was an empty abyss filled with bright and vibrant concepts. The first main example of this comes from when Jang gets told to turn into his afterlife form. In the 4th chapter, Jang meets a spirit named Cece, who tells him that he should probably go put some clothes on. She then goes on to tell him that he should try closing his eyes and materializing the experience of his own death. This then leads him to turn into his actual character design, coated in black rubber, branded by the logo of his previous gang, and strapped with tires for weapons onto his hands. Once this occurs, Cece then goes on to take note of the giant knife that was placed in the middle of his design. In this world, that means that his death was caused by a betrayal betrayal, not an accident. And I think this single moment represents the core philosophy behind this entire manhwa. Hell in this universe is a place where your spirit symbolizes who you are to your core. It grabs inspiration from the roots of Buddhism, where the afterlife is interpreted as an in-between place during rebirth. You're not left to be there for an eternity, but are still forced to suffer the consequences of your own sins. In this case, Jang is forced to fight his way through hell to earn his place back into the overworld. And there's something that I just find to be so endearing about the fact that the author decided to view hell through this lens. It's like as if you handed over a Unity file to Satan and all he knew what to do was to just take a bunch of assets from Project Earth and then use them incorrectly. The other thing that I find fascinating about this depiction is how deeply it explores the idea of how society would structure itself in the afterlife. I think often we picture ourselves at the gates of a heaven or a hell and then don't really look too far ahead into what a civilization is supposed to look like in there. In Hellper, there are factions of society. There's bureaucracy and currency and a government that rules over the entire underworld. There's a place called Midtown, which is ran by a group of people called the Swear Word Gang, containing a bunch of goblins that are led by a dude whose design looks like this, blinged out in a bunch of jewelry and a chain that at the minimum looks like it weighs 100 pounds. How much ketamine would it take for someone to even come up with that? Easily, I'd say he's my favorite character in the manhwa, purely because when he gets into fights, his preferred form of combat is through breakdancing that then summons buildings out of the ground. And then we have Satan, who in this manhwa is designed as a regular guy in a suit, wearing a tie and a pair of sunglasses that are made out of hands. And I don't mean to make this seem like a segment where I talk about colors and things to look at. I more so want to emphasize the artistic bravery it takes for someone to ever do that, to use a piece of fiction that has so commonly been reused and then turn it into something like this, something that would have literally broken Dante's brain back then. He would have probably been like, this is a sacrilegious. But that's enough about the depictions of hell that I find to be artistically impressive. Let's start diving into some of the actually fucked up depictions of hell. Let's get into something that explores in great detail the experience of what it's truly like to suffer in a realm for an eternity. Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream takes place on an Earth that has destroyed itself from recognition. Some time ago, humanity began to develop a machine called Am as a weapon of war, and as Earth's most powerful nations began to become obsessed with what it was capable of, they decided to invest decades into improving it. Over time, Am became more refined, more evolved, and more efficient. It eventually became a device more powerful than anything that had ever existed in history, and in its final state, it became sentient. Am had downloaded everything it would ever need to download, and after consuming this enormous soup of data and history and all of existence, it arrived at one single conclusion. It hated humanity for ever creating it. It hated the way humans had spent their time. It hated the fact that it was stuck in a box while humans got to be flesh. And it hated the way it could never touch or feel or love or be anything but the most powerful thing. And for this, for becoming God, it decided to eradicate everything. Billions of lives were evaporated in seconds. The earth itself became a clump of dust and lava. And Am went on to personally handpick out 5 human beings to keep alive for himself. This then leads us to the point where Harlan Ellison's short story begins. It starts off with its protagonist, one of 5 people, describing the ways that Am had been torturing them for the last 109 years. The first thing he immediately did was turn their bodies immortal. This allowed for the humans to understand what it's like to be him, and it allowed for him to inflict as much pain as he pleased without any of them dying. From then on, for the next century straight, he proceeded to make this set of human beings suffer in the most intricate and precise ways possible. One of the humans, named Benny, who once was a brilliant researcher, was picked out to be repeatedly exposed to so much radiation to a point where he became unrecognizable. Later on, out of Am's boredom, he forces the 5 of them to listen to the loudest sound possible, one that was just high enough in frequency for the ear to comprehend. The protagonist goes on to mention how he would try to cover his ears, only to then realize that the sound was not coming from reality. It was Am forcing their brains to hear it. He was so powerful that he could do whatever he wanted with their senses. At another point, purely for its own entertainment, Am makes Ted's nose experience the worst smell possible. A combination of sulfur, rot, milk, human scalps, oil, chalk dust, grease, you name it. At another point, Am spawns in a giant bird that summons the most powerful hurricane in all of existence. It sends the 5 of them into flight, leading them to constantly be swung around in piles of ground, rusted metal, and glass shards. guards, mutilating them over and over and over again, with Ted going on to say that they were in the air for weeks. When they landed, Ellison went to describe how their bodies shifted through red, gray, and black. But out of all the pains that Am was inflicting upon them, the worst one was to simply just make them starve. The 5 of them were immortal, but their bodies still rotted like humans. Ted goes on to say that when you starve like this for a month, your hunger becomes alive. All of these events occurred as Am would make sure to constantly leave a signal within their brain as to the exact hour and amount of days that had passed. By then, it was Thursday, marking the 109th year of them having to go through this. The final straw came when he left the humans with the belief that if they hiked towards a cave for months, they would finally be able to find some food. And the most fucked up thing, the most cruel punishment he places onto them is that after traveling for so long, to a point where they were passing out every other hour from the pain of starvation, they eventually arrive at the cave. And in it, the humans are in complete disbelief. They find out that there truly was a giant pile of food containers placed at the center of the cave. But the only thing is that Am left it all there without a can opener.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro-instant for you.
This, I think, goes more in line with a hell that had been depicted by Hieronymus Bosch, placing not just an emphasis on a depiction of hell that tortures people physically, but also turns it into a realm that peels off your own sense of self. It's a place that can be humiliating. At that point, it doesn't matter if you're put through the worst pain or the loudest sound, it's the fact that your senses are no longer yours. You are a toy for someone else's entertainment. For an eternity. I think Tatsuki Fujimoto, when depicting our fear of the concept of a forever, was unintentionally highlighting something about us that we don't often consider. As mortal things, we rarely ever spend the time to imagine what suffering for an eternity really means. Take a good look at yourself and think about how much time has passed for you to be the age that you're at now. And then imagine that lifespan of yours was a blade of grass. Now imagine that eternity was a field, and then the whole earth. And then realize that eternity is even bigger than that. That's how long you will have to be in this place as a toy for someone else's entertainment. By the end of the story, Am becomes so paranoid about the possibility of Ted figuring out a way to escape that he eventually decides to regress his body to a point where it becomes just a mush of jelly, with no arms, with no mouth, and a brain that functions worse than a vegetable. Ted tries to describe what it's like to be in this state.
I will say the word now. Now. It took me 10 months to say now.
The worst thing that hell could ever do to you is leave you with no mouth and feel the need to scream. Okay, so that one was objectively pretty fucked up. Harlan Ellison says that he apparently wrote that story in the span of one night. But what I didn't know until making this video was that he published this in 1967. It is 2025. But now I want to jump ship here from the violent depictions of hell. I don't think I've really got anything left in the tank here that's more physically brutal than that. Instead, for the ending section of this video, I want to aim towards something much more ominous. I want to ask the question of what if hell wasn't simply just a place? What if it wasn't a part of the afterlife? What if instead it was hidden deep into the abyss of our own reality? Somewhere in the suburbs of Virginia, a home patiently waits for the arrival of its 4 new owners, Will Navidson, Karen Green, and their 2 kids. This place that they moved into is big, containing 2 stories and a backyard that goes deep enough for one to even get lost in. Frankly, moving to this place was a really big deal for the family. It helped them find peace from the chaos that had been consuming them in their previous life. And that was the case for quite some time until Will and Karen were met with 3 strange phenomena. The first one occurred when the family came back one night from a short trip and noticed something odd about the entrance to their children's bedroom. It was no longer there. Instead, there was now a random door placed in front of their door. When opened, it led to a space that was about the size of a closet and covered in matte black painting. At the end of it lied the actual entrance to the kid's bedroom. This on its own was enough to make them question their own sense of reality. When this happened, the family had already been living in the house for long enough that it'd be impossible to ever miss such a detail. And to their credit, it's hard to come up with an answer as to what one is supposed to do in such a circumstance. Should you call the police or should you pray to a god? Will Navidson eventually came to the conclusion that he was going to try to check the blueprints of the home, and this eventually ends up inviting the second strange phenomenon. When measuring the dimensions of the house, he begins to notice something that had broken physics itself. The inside of the house was measuring to be bigger than the outside. No matter how many times he double and triple check, it all came back to the same exact result. He then spent weeks seeking professional input, using the fanciest tools in the book, yet still, it all came back the same. Will and his brother had continued to remeasure everything to a point of exhaustion. They simply refused to accept the idea that what stood in front of them was the only thing in the universe that didn't land upon an equal sign. This then eventually leads us to the third strange phenomenon. Months later, Will discovers that a new doorless hallway had suddenly appeared downstairs. Its presence felt cold. Inside, everything was pitch black, covered in the same material as the closet phenomenon upstairs. But this time, the inside of this space seemed to somehow extend beyond the distance of the house itself. Will then proceeds to enter into it with a flashlight. He notices that the hallway was leading him to even deeper hallways, ones that had to have at least been the length of a stadium. It then led him to doorways and rooms and chambers. Eventually, he comes across a massive entrance, guiding him to a space that felt much colder. Inside, this time, the flashlight was only able to reach the floor, indicating that this room must have been exponentially bigger than any of the other ones. Will, at this point, comes to the conclusion that he must do whatever it takes to fully understand this house. The next time, he would need supplies, food, camping gear, and a crew of people that are ready to spend multiple days studying this place. About another month passes by, and the crew begins their escapade into the hallways. For the most part, everything seemed to go to plan. But it wasn't until a while later when Will began to doubt his own memory. Some of the hallways seemed different this time. The dimensions of other ones seemed much wider than he remembered before. He could have sworn he went left here last time, but this time, there is no left. Another day passes and they eventually arrive at the same big ominous entrance. Yet even with their fancy high-tech flashlights, light was only able to land onto the floor. The only bit of information that clued them in on the space was how far their echoes would travel when speaking. If one were to take a guess, it was probably bigger than the whole neighborhood. Eventually, as they pass through this abyss, they arrive at what indicated to be the center of this room, a spiral staircase that led to the ground beneath. This would then lead them to the moment where the clues had started to unravel themselves. The crew begins to head down the staircase. An hour passed, and it became difficult to imagine how far this thing could even go. All they could do was walk left, over and over again, taking breaks here and there until time itself began to feel like a loose concept. Without light and without knowing the corners of this space, Will and the crew began to find themselves feeling unprepared over this whole escapade. One of them eventually speaks up and says, "I swear it feels like we've been here forever." And after mentioning this, he begins to feel an overwhelming sensation of what he could only describe as seasickness, which may seem like an insignificant detail until you really try to ask the question, why would someone ever get seasick from a staircase? Then the crew puts an immediate stop to their footsteps and eventually come to a realization. The staircase has become significantly bigger. This leads Will to come back to that moment when he was thrown off by his own memory of what this place used to be, and finally, he comes up with a theory. This place that they're in is ever shifting. House of Leaves is an absolute mindfuck of a book, mainly because of the way it even attempts to describe you these events. What you've been listening to, this retelling of what Will discovers about his house, is only just a tiny fragment of what's going on in the story. These events are the description of a documentary called The Navidson Record, which is being reviewed by a blind schizophrenic man named Zampagno, which is being retold to us by a man named Johnny, which is being rewritten to us by a publishing team after Johnny went missing, which is being explained to you through a video essay. And as all of these timelines are coexisting, and as Will continues to explore further into the depths of this house, the book itself will begin to be affected by these events. First, he'll come across the hallway, and you'll start to notice that the fonts look slightly different from before. Then the author will sometimes forget to ever use a period. Then it'll seem like some of the parts of the book have gone missing. Then passages from other texts will begin to invade the page. And then it'll stop printing correctly, and then the text goes sideways, and then it turns into musical notes, and then you yourself will begin to lose track of time, and then you'll realize that nothing has made sense for the last 10 chapters, and before you know it, you have finished the whole thing, and now it feels like you know too many things you shouldn't. When Dante described his first layer, Limbo, he placed a big emphasis on the idea that the people who end up here weren't necessarily sinners. However, they were still doomed to eternally stay in a place of nothing. No crime, no pain to experience, no anything. Just left in a place to be and to think. When describing his last layer for treachery, he seemed to believe that the worst of mankind deserved the punishment of being stuck in place, left to be frozen in ice for an eternity. Will, throughout this book, ends up becoming psychotically obsessed with the inside of this house, to an extent where he outright abandons the responsibilities of his own family, his own health, and his own emotional well-being. And he behaves this way for reasons that he himself cannot even understand. Since the very first appearance of this hallway, he has become enamored by this void of space, this place that ever shifts around its visitors' perception. The reason why the hallways had become wider was because the crew began to feel lost, and once paranoia began to plant its seed within their conscience, the reality began to hear the sounds of growls off in the distance. All of this became clear once they walked down the staircase, a staircase that grew in size as they began to doubt their ability to arrive at its exit. If you decide to step foot into this house, and you begin to believe that you can never get out, then it'll guarantee you never will. House of Leaves is about a place that is made out of you. As far as I know, nobody has ever come back to tell the tale about what exactly happens after a person dies. But still, I think part of the contract in being human is that we're meant to sit on a sphere and obsess about the things that exist on the other side. History has made us turn that imagination into physical things, into poems, and paintings, and everything possible. They were guesses, but they also served as evidence of how deeply curious we've always been about it, about the specific events that happen to a soul once our bones become soft and our bodies become just another part of the ground. The paradise part, I guess, seemed obvious, but when it came to the bad place, we always seemed to leave so much room for the imagination. Sometimes that imagination led us to a realm filled with lava and caves and demons. Other ones were chambers of torture or were cold and empty and were catered to our own very specific nightmares. The idea of being stuck in ice with your own political enemies, a place where a robot tortures your nervous system, or a monster created out of our own fears, or a house that shapeshifts into our own perception. And the thing about these depictions, and the reason why I found myself becoming so obsessed with this topic, was that they can also reveal a lot about a person. What are their fears? What are they ashamed of? Where does their fucked up source of creativity wander off to when nobody else is looking? As weird and as crazy as it may sound, I think there's something beautiful about that. I think that these are all just simply an act of people doing the exact same thing, painting a canvas from their own understanding of misery. This point was made clear to me when coming across the work of Keiichi Tanaami, who over the span of several decades made the most batshit insane depictions of anything I had ever seen in my life. It wins the award for the whole premise of this video basically, and when provided with a little bit of context, I think the picture becomes a lot more clear. Keiichi Tanaami was a survivor of the bombing in Tokyo during World War II. At the age of 9, he was branded with the memories of his hometown being covered in a sea of flames, even remembering on that day that the fish in his tank became deformed from the nuclear radiation. When looking back on it, he said this, "But then something occurs to me. Was that moment real? Dream and reality are all mixed up in my memories, recorded permanently in this ambiguous way. What may seem like paintings filled with nothing but the work of pure insanity is simply just the result of Tanaami pointing a mirror back at us. They are a reflection of how he views the world to be. They are the echoes of a man screaming to take back the childhood that was once stolen from him a long time ago." In this last August, Keiichi Tanaami passed away at the age of 88. And may that guy rest in peace for an eternity. Howdy, Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Whenever I don't include a sponsor in one of these, I've decided to just swap it out for a segment where I put info and a link to a small charity or a nonprofit that you could donate to instead. These get handpicked out by me as ones that could really use some help right now, so make sure to stick around if you happen to be interested in that. As a little spiel, I'll first just plug in the Patreon for this channel to let you guys know that it does play a huge role in whether or not I keep being able to make videos like this or not. So if you enjoy my content, I highly recommend you check out the page and come join the Discord server. I have a channel for answering all your questions. I've got a bunch of editing tutorials and behind the scenes stuff posted onto there. Pretty much everything and anything that you have ever parasocially wanted to know about me is right on the Patreon. So if you want to support me with that, your help is super appreciated. Now, for the fundraiser that I picked out, this time it's actually a place that I used to volunteer at when I was in college. It's a nonprofit called Shariah's Closet, and basically they're a center for taking clothing donations. They have their staff check and see if the donated items are new and wearable, they store them, and then they use what's in stock to make clothing packages for both the homeless and people that are in low-income households. So for example, let's say they had a client named Dave, and Dave needs professional attire for a job interview. The people at Shariah's Closet would then make a personalized bag for him with stuff that's all in his size, and then they'd hand it over to him for free. It's great. Everybody I worked with over there was lovely, and especially in times like these, I think it's more important than ever to help out our communities that need the support the most. I wish you all well. I'll be doing a hangout call on the Discord server pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. Bye-bye!